I'm going to start with this. This is a newspaper article that was copied in a Dallas Police Department document. So apparently the Dallas police are interested too. This appeared in the Chicago Tribune, Tuesday, November 26th. Mexico paper says Oswald went to Reds. Reveals visit to Russians and Cuban consulates. And this is how the story that Oswald went to Mexico City and visited the embassies, this is how it became public. Mexico City, November 25th, UPI. The newspaper Excelsior said today, Lee Harvey Oswald spent several days in Mexico City in late September, calling on consulates of the Soviet Union and Cuba. Excelsior said Oswald crossed the border at Laredo, Texas on September 26th and drove to Mexico City where on September 28th he called on the Consulate General of Cuba and asked for a transit visa to Moscow by way of Havana. The United States Customs Service at Laredo confirmed the crossing, a spokesman said. There are records to establish this. The records also showed Oswald re-entered the United States October 3rd. Leaves in huff. Excelsior said the Cuban consulate told Oswald it could not issue the visa without talking to the United States government, and that would take 10 or 12 days. The paper said Oswald left the office in a huff and slammed the door as he went. The next day he appeared at the office of the Soviet consul and asked for a visa directly to the Soviet Union. The newspaper said Oswald supported his argument for the visa by saying his wife was a Soviet citizen, that he was a communist, and that he had lived in Russia for 3 years. Told of long wait, the Soviet consul told him the normal time to process such requests would be about 3 months. Oswald again left in a huff, the paper said. The newspaper said there was no indication Oswald talked to any important officials of the Soviet or Cuban embassies other than the respective consuls. I have not been able to find the original article. It's probably in Spanish. I don't know, though, if it has more details than this or not. This is the UPI version that appeared in the Chicago Tribune. And the way the story is written, it sounds to me as if this paragraph was not in the Mexican newspaper, but probably came from UPI, where they're talking about checking with U.S. Customs Service at Laredo. The way it's written, it sounds like that was not in the Mexican newspaper article. And I want to mention, this part seems a little odd to me, where it says the Cuban consulate told Oswald it could not issue the visa without talking to the United States government. That seems very unlikely. That can't be true, but I think it's interesting that it's in this article, because really what they should have said was the Soviet government. That's who had to be contacted, not the U.S. government. So what I want to know is where this information came from. Who leaked this information to Excelsior? We know that Duran was interrogated by the Mexican Federal Police November 23rd into November 24th. So it's possible, you might think, that the Mexican government would have leaked this to the newspaper. But this paragraph that says what happened in the Soviet embassy, it seems to me, could only have come from somebody who would have known what happened to the Soviet embassy, and that would have been the Soviets, anyone the Soviets may have told, like the Cubans, or the CIA, who was monitoring the telephone communications. So I don't think the source would have been the Mexican police, the Mexican government, because I don't think Mexican officials would know what was happening in the Soviet embassy. That's something only the Soviets and the Americans would know. So the source must be either the Soviets or the CIA. And I think for various reasons the source is probably the Soviets or the Cubans. Because the CIA, would the CIA, ever concerned about their sources and methods, choose to leak information which would show that they knew what was going on inside the Soviet embassy? if you've read the documents, the CIA documents, you know that they are obsessed with protecting their sources and methods. And I think it's very unlikely that they would have leaked the story to a newspaper, in Mexico especially, where you would think they would have less control probably, revealing that they know what's being said inside the Soviet embassy. And the newspaper, the Excelsior, at the time of the assassination, was a worker-owned cooperative. And so a worker-owned cooperative shows that you have an organization which is sympathetic to the goals of socialism and communism. People who believe in the cooperatives, the cooperative movement, probably wouldn't advertise that they were friends of communists. In fact, a lot of them would try to deny that they liked communism, just for the survival probably. But the fact is that a worker-owned cooperative is going to have sympathetic views with socialists and communists. So I think this might have been a communist-friendly newspaper. I don't know that, but I think it's a possibility. And I think that means it's more likely the Cubans or the Soviets would have leaked the information to this newspaper. Of course, the CIA could have contacts anywhere, even in actual communist organizations. So it's not impossible that the CIA could have done it. But I think it makes more sense that the Cubans or the Soviets leaked this information to the newspaper. And also this line about, that I pointed out earlier, about Cuba would have to talk to the United States government before they could issue Oswald a visa. I think that's a kind of a deflection, because since it's the Soviet government, whoever leaked this information doesn't want you thinking about the Soviet government. They'd rather have you thinking about the United States government. So that might be why it says that there. So I think probably this story was leaked to Excelsior by the Soviets or the Cubans. And I think this is consistent with the Mexico City episode being a Soviet or a Cuban intelligence operation, not a CIA operation. That is, I don't think what goes on in Mexico City here, I don't think the purpose of it is to set up Oswald. I don't think the CIA is setting up Oswald as the patsy, with the purpose of going to invade Cuba or anything else. I mean, if you look at the CIA documents themselves, where they have the transcripts of the telephone conversations that were intercepted, this is, there's little differences in details, but this is perfectly consistent with the idea that the Soviets and the Cubans are completely innocent. There's nothing in there to suggest that the Soviets and the Cubans are on Team Oswald. Everything suggests that the Soviets and the Cubans have no interest in Oswald. They don't want to help him, they don't want to give him money, they don't want to let him travel. They have no interest in him whatsoever. So if the CIA was trying to set up Oswald, why would they create these conversations that show the Cubans and the Russians to be innocent? And there's no need to do this if you're setting up Oswald personally, because you don't need him to go to Mexico City to set him up as a patsy if he's just going to be some commie. And maybe this makes it look even more interesting, I don't know. And it was used by LBJ as leverage. This possible involvement of the Soviets and the Cubans was used by LBJ as leverage to get Earl Warren and others to participate in the cover-up. But I think that was just because it was handy. If you look at the actual facts, the Soviets and the Cubans are not implicated at all. And so I think this is part of a Cuban or Soviet operation which was meant to say the Soviets and the Cubans were not involved at all with Oswald and whatever it is he might do in the future. So I think that as far as Oswald was concerned, when he went to Mexico City, he was working for the Soviets and or the Cubans. That this was not a CIA operation. Of course, I think they knew about it, but I don't think they were in charge of it. I think they were piggybacking along.